Run your thumb across the base of your palm right now. Slowly, with enough pressure to feel the muscle underneath. Did you feel that line? That gentle groove that crosses the base of your palm, separating the fleshy mound of the hand from the rest of the surface? Anatomists call it the thenar line, but there is a text written nearly 2,000 years ago, discovered buried in a ceramic jar in the Egyptian desert in 1945, that calls this same line something else. The Apocryphon of John calls the line you feel there the threshold mark. And if this text is right, that sensation you just had in your own hand was no accident. It was a recognition. Something inside you just touched something that was waiting to be touched. In the next 30 minutes, you will understand why Gnostic texts hidden for nearly 1,700 years describe a specific mark on the human body as the border between the world you can see and a world you were never taught to perceive. You will understand what the builders of this world did not want you to know about your own body, and you will understand why the threshold mark was not placed there by chance. But first, I need to tell you where it all begins. And it begins long before you were born. Before the time you know as time. There is an entire cosmology that was suppressed, not accidentally erased, not lost in the flow of history, but actively, deliberately, and violently suppressed. Bishops ordered the burning of copies. Councils decided what was sacred and what was heresy, and what was declared heresy was, without exception, any text that described the creation of the world in a way different from the official version. The official version says that God created the world and the world is good. The texts that were burned say something completely different. They say that the world was created by a being who is not the supreme God, a being who did not know there was anything above him, a being who built this reality as a prison and placed inside each cell a spark of something that was never meant to be here, something that came from a place he could never reach, something he stole without understanding what he was stealing. This spark, in Greek, is called pneuma, the breath, the divine spark, and the human body was constructed around it to keep it contained. The Apocryphon of John describes this process with a precision that should be impossible for a second-century text. It describes architects, invisible builders called Archons, each responsible for a part of the physical shell we call the human body, 7 layers of creation, 7 levels of imprisonment, and at the center of it all, the pneumatic spark, imprisoned within flesh and bone without having asked to be here. But here is what the text says the Archons could not erase. When the spark was placed inside the body, it left marks, not metaphors, not poetic symbolism, physical marks, points of contact between the being you truly are and the prison you inhabit. And these marks, according to the Apocryphon of John, are located in the places where the body meets the limit between the interior and the exterior, at the thresholds. And now I must ask you, can you still feel that line in the palm of your hand? Because what I am about to show you now will change what you think about it forever. The complete text of the Apocryphon of John survived in 4 copies. 4. In a world where heresy hunters destroyed everything they found, 4 copies escaped. 2 are in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. 1 sat in the National Library of Paris for centuries without anyone understanding what it was. And 1 was found in that ceramic jar, along with 52 other texts, in a small town called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. A peasant digging for fertilizer. A sealed ceramic jar. Inside, papyri wrapped in leather. He almost set fire to the whole material to use as cooking fuel. His mother intervened for fear that they were dangerous magical documents. And so the greatest discovery of ancient texts of the 20th century was nearly destroyed before any scholar could get near it. What was inside that jar was an entire library of knowledge that the official church had spent centuries trying to eradicate. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia, the Secret Book of James, and the Apocryphon of John, considered by many scholars to be the most important Gnostic text to survive, the most detailed map of the cosmology that religious orthodoxy suppressed. And on this map, there is a passage that Western translators treated as a metaphor for decades. A passage about what happens at the moment the divine spark is inserted into the physical shell. The text says that the spark does not enter without resistance. That the physical body, built by the Archons to be a perfect prison, presents a point of least resistance, a place where the border between the imprisoned and the imprisoner is thinnest. And this place, the original Coptic text, calls ma-en-tash, which translators have generally translated as place of passage or threshold of form. But the word tash, in late Coptic, has a second meaning that almost never appears in academic translations. It can mean the line that divides, the line that separates, the mark that indicates where one thing ends and another begins, the physical threshold. Now look at the palm of your hand again. The thenar muscle, that fleshy mound at the base of the thumb, is anatomically separated from the rest of the palm by a skin fold that anatomists call the proximal thenar crease. It is a structure that exists in all human beings, invariably, regardless of race, genetics, or physical condition. It is not a developmental line. It does not arise from pressure or use. It is there from before birth, formed during embryonic development, long before any hand has ever done anything. It is the line that separates what moves autonomously, the thumb with its unique opposability in the animal kingdom, from the rest of the static palm. It is literally a threshold of mobility, a border within your own body, and the Apocryphon of John, written while Rome was still persecuting Christians, while most of Europe was still an untouched forest, identifies exactly this anatomical point as the place where something passed through. You need to stop for a moment and let that sink in, because we are talking about a 2,000-year-old text that describes human anatomy in a way that would only become clinically verifiable with the development of modern embryology. There is no simple explanation for this. Either the author of the Apocryphon of John had access to knowledge about the human body that should not have existed in the 2nd century, or, as the text itself claims, this knowledge did not come from human observation. It came from within. This is the central claim of Gnosticism. Not that sacred knowledge comes from the outside, revealed by an external God who decides to share it, but that sacred knowledge is inside you, imprisoned within the pneumatic spark, and the only way to access it is to wake up to what you truly are. And the pneumatics, the bearers of the divine spark, are identifiable, not by behavior, not by religious choice, not by devotion, by something that is written on the body, by marks. Now I need to take you deeper, because the threshold mark is not the only thing the Apocryphon of John describes. And when you understand the complete system, the palm of your hand will seem like a text you have always possessed, but never learned to read. The Apocryphon of John is structured as a dialogue. John, the disciple of Jesus, is in a state of mourning after the crucifixion when he receives a vision. A being appears to him, changing form, child, elder, youth, and begins to reveal what truly happened at creation. Not what the canonical texts say, what actually happened. The entity speaking to John identifies itself as the voice of the Father, the Mother, and the Son in a single presence. And it tells John that it came to teach what is, what was, and what will happen, so that you may know what is invisible and what is visible. What is invisible and what is visible. This phrase is the key to everything. The text then describes the structure of the cosmos in layers. At the top, what the text calls the monad, the one, the supreme being who is so far beyond any conception that the text uses more than 40 pages just to describe what it is not. It is not finite. It is not measurable. It did not create anything out of necessity, because it has no need for anything. It simply is, beyond any predicate. From this one, by a kind of involuntary overflow of fullness, emanate the aeons, beings of light, emanations of the supreme being who inhabit what the text calls the pleroma, the fullness, the place where there is no absence of anything. The place where that feeling comes from when you sense you came from somewhere that this world is not. And then something happens that the text describes as the great tragedy of creation. One of the youngest aeons, named Sophia, wisdom in Greek, acts impulsively. She desires to create without her complementary pair, without the consent of the one. And what she generates from this imperfect desire is an aberration, a creature that should not exist, a being of power without light, a spark of creativity without the warmth of fullness. The text calls this being Yaldabaoth, which in Aramaic means approximately son of chaos, or in another reading, son of darkness. Sophia, horrified by what she generated, hides Yaldabaoth in a veil of clouds so that the other Aeons cannot see him. And Yaldabaoth, surrounded by darkness and clouds, believes he is alone. He believes he is the only being that exists. And from this mistaken belief, he utters the words that the text records literally, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God besides me." Those words, that jealousy, that claim of exclusivity. If you know the Old Testament, you have heard those words before. In Exodus, in Deuteronomy, in the Second Commandment, and the text of the Apocryphon of John asserts that this proves the being speaking in the Old Testament is not the supreme God. Because the supreme God is not jealous, he does not need to defend himself against comparisons. He does not need to forbid the worship of other gods because there is no insecurity in fullness. Jealousy is the mark of the creature, not the creator. Yaldabaoth then creates his own Archons, 7 architects of the material world, and with them he builds the 7 heavens of the cosmos, the 7 spheres that occultism and ancient astrology have always described as the boundaries of the imprisoned world. And after building the shell of the cosmos, he decides to create something in the likeness of the image he saw reflected in the waters below the pleroma, an image of the perfect human being, the divine anthropos, the human model that exists in the pleroma as pure idea before any matter. But here is where the tragedy becomes something greater. When Yaldabaoth and his Archons build the atom of physical material, the creature they create is inert, an empty shell, a body without what would truly make it alive. Then Yaldabaoth, without understanding what he is doing, breathes into this body. And what comes out of him in this breath is not just air, it is a portion of the spiritual power he received from Sophia, a spark of the pleroma that passed from Sophia to Yaldabaoth without him knowing, and which now, in this act of breathing, passes from Yaldabaoth to the human being. The jailer accidentally placed the key inside the prison, and the moment the spark enters the physical body, the text describes something that happens in the material structure of the shell. A pressure, a tension between what is spiritual and what is material. The spiritual is too vast for the shell that contains it. And at the points where this tension is greatest, where the pressure of the spiritual against the material is most intense, the text says that marks appear. The threshold lines, the points where the inside touches the outside. And the threshold mark on the palm of the hand is, according to the text, the point of greatest pressure, because the hand is the instrument. It is through touch that humans know the world. It is through the palm that the internal meets the external most directly and most constantly. The thenar line is where the spark most frequently touches the surface of the world. Now look at it again. With different eyes. What you are seeing is not anatomy. You are seeing the imprint of something that has no physical form trying to exist within a physical space. You are seeing the evidence that you are not just what this world says you are, but wait, because the Apocryphon of John is not alone in this. And when other Nag Hammadi texts say the same thing using completely different languages, the coincidence becomes impossible. The pattern becomes proof. The Gospel of Philip, another text from the Nag Hammadi library, uses a language different from the Apocryphon of John but arrives at the same place. Where the Apocryphon uses cosmology to explain the structure of the world, the Gospel of Philip uses sacraments, rituals, physical acts that reveal spiritual realities. And there is a passage in the Gospel of Philip that scholars often skim over because it seems too cryptic for direct interpretation. The text says that as it is above, so it is below, and as it is below, so it is above, and as it is inside, so it is outside, and as it is outside, so it is inside. This mirror-like language, this play of reflections, is usually treated as mystical poetry, but it is an instruction. As it is above, so it is below. The spiritual cosmos has its mirror in the material cosmos. The pleroma has its reflection in the physical world, not as something lesser or degraded, but as a reflection, an impression, like the negative of a photograph that only becomes a complete image when developed. As it is inside, so it is outside. The pneumatic spark, absolutely interior, absolutely invisible, is at the same time manifest on the outside, not in an obvious way, not in a way that anyone can see, but in a way that those who know what to look for can find in the threshold marks. And the Gospel of Philip says something that the Apocryphon of John only implies. These marks are not the same in all human beings. The Gospel of Philip divides humanity into three categories that classical Gnosticism inherited from an even older tradition. The helics, those who are only matter, those who have no divine spark or have a spark so dim it is indistinguishable from matter. The psychics, those who have a soul, those who have a spark, but it is so wrapped in the layers of the psyche, of emotions, of material desires, that it rarely manifests. And the pneumatics, those who have the divine breath in its most intense form, those who carry the brightest spark, those who came directly from the pleroma before any filter. And for the pneumatics, the text states, the threshold marks are more pronounced, more visible, more sensorially present. This is why I asked you to run your thumb over that line. Not everyone feels what you just felt. Not everyone has that specific sense of recognition, that the line was waiting to be touched. For many people it is just skin, just anatomy, just the physical body being what it is. But if you are watching this video, if you have come this far, if that sensation in the palm of your hand was more than anatomical, if there was something you cannot name but recognized as real, then you must consider that perhaps the Gnostic texts are describing something that is not a metaphor. Perhaps they are describing you. The Pistis Sophia, the longest Gnostic text to survive, goes even further in describing the pneumatics. It is a complex text, structured as a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples after the resurrection, in a version very different from the canonical narrative, and in it, Jesus describes the bearers of the purest spark as beings who carry the impression of the pleroma in their physical bodies, not spiritually, not metaphorically, physically. The text says that the luminous force inhabiting the pneumatic is so intense that it leaves marks on the material shell in the same way a hot seal leaves a mark on wax. The pressure of the spiritual against the physical creates lines, points of tension that become permanent, maps of what is inside printed on the surface outside, and the Pistis Sophia describes 4 primary points of this map, 4 places on the body where the tension between the spiritual and the material is most extreme. 4 thresholds: the forehead, where thought touches the world; the temples, where the interior reverberates with the exterior; the palms of the hands, where the being touches what is outside of itself; and the soles of the feet, where the pneumatic literally treads upon the material world while maintaining constant contact with the land of the Archons. 4 thresholds, 4 points of contact, 4 places where who you truly are presses against what this world says you are. And if you have ever been to a palm reading, if you have ever had someone hold your palm and trace the lines, if you have ever felt that strange vulnerability of having your hand read, now you know why. It is not superstition. It is not groundless mysticism. Palmistry, in its most ancient origin, before it became fairground entertainment, was the reading of the map that the spark prints on the flesh. It was the reading of the threshold marks. But I need to go deeper still, because there is something Gnostic texts say about pneumatics that goes beyond physical marks. Something about what it means to carry this spark in this world. Something about why this knowledge was suppressed with such violence. Because if the pneumatics are identifiable, if they carry physical marks of their different origin, then they are dangerous, not to other human beings, to Yaldabaoth. The Apocryphon of John describes Yaldabaoth's panic when he realizes that the spark he accidentally placed inside Adam is more powerful than anything he can create. The human being with the divine spark becomes more luminous, more capable, more free than any Archon. And Yaldabaoth, in his jealousy and fear, makes a decision that the text describes in disturbing detail. He creates forgetfulness, not just physical forgetfulness, the natural amnesia that accompanies birth, but an active veil, a structure of deliberate forgetfulness, built within the very system that creates the material world. Each time a pneumatic spark incarnates in a physical body, it passes through this veil. And the veil does not erase the spark, because the spark cannot be destroyed. But it obscures, it covers, it makes the spark forget what it is. And what the pneumatics do throughout their entire lives, without knowing they are doing it, is try to remember. It is what lies beneath all genuine spiritual seeking, not the acquisition of knowledge, but the recovery of memory. Not learning something new, but recognizing something that was always there. And recognition does not come from the mind. It comes from the body. It comes from the marks. When you touched that line on the palm of your hand and felt something that was not just touch, that was recognition. Not of a Gnostic doctrine, not of an idea, of what you are before this world tells you what you should be. And this leads me to something that the Gnostic texts say, which is possibly the most radical statement in the entire Nag Hammadi library. The pneumatics do not come to learn. They come to awaken. It is not the same thing. Learning presupposes a state of ignorance that needs to be filled with external information. You do not know, so someone who knows teaches you. You were empty, now you are full. It is the model of all conventional education, of every orthodox religious structure. A priest knows, you do not. A sacred scripture holds the knowledge, you need it to access it. But awakening presupposes that the knowledge is already inside you, that there is nothing to learn, that there is only the veil to be removed, and that the veil cannot be removed by external teaching. It can only be removed by internal recognition. What you recognize when you touch the threshold mark is not a Gnostic doctrine. It is your own origin. And this is exactly what Yaldabaoth feared. It is exactly what led his human representatives, the guardians of religious orthodoxy, to burn all the books that describe this process. Because an awakened pneumatic cannot be controlled by religious structures. They do not need an intermediary between themselves and the divine. They do not need a priest. They do not need a temple. They do not need a doctrine approved by a council. They have direct access. The spark within recognizes the flame without needing translation, and systems of power, religious or otherwise, do not survive people who do not need them. But now I must ask you a question that will change how you see the coming weeks of your life. What other marks do you have? Because the threshold mark on the palm of the hand is the most accessible, the easiest to feel, the one the Apocryphon of John mentions most directly. But it is not the only one. And the other marks the text describes are not physical in the same way. They are experiential. They are patterns of how you exist in the world that do not fit what should be expected. The text speaks of knowing without having learned. There are things you simply know, not because someone taught you, not because you read it somewhere, but because the knowledge was there before any external source. Not intuition, not a hunch. Certainty, a certainty that has no identifiable origin. The text speaks of feeling displacement, not depression in the clinical sense, but a persistent sensation that you do not exactly belong here, that the rules that seem natural to everyone around you seem arbitrary to you, that the goals that mobilize the people around you seem, at heart, lighter than they should be, as if you knew, without being taught, that there is something beyond them. The text speaks of recognition without cause, places you visit for the first time that seem familiar, people you meet for the first time with whom you feel an inexplicable connection, moments of déjà vu that are too intense to be neurological. The Gnostic text would call these moments tears in the veil, instants where the forgetfulness imposed by Yaldabaoth thins and you see through. And the text speaks of a search that is never satisfied, a spiritual hunger that no conventional religious structure can completely satiate, that you can be in a temple, you can be in a ritual, you can be surrounded by people of the same faith and still feel that what you are seeking is one step beyond what is being offered. Not arrogance, not dissatisfaction, an internal compass that points in a direction that the available maps do not show. If any of these marks resonate, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not broken. You are waking up. The Corpus Hermeticum, the collection of Hermetic texts that shares intellectual roots with Gnosticism, describes the pneumatic in a state of awakening as someone undergoing a process called anamnesis. The Greek word literally means non-forgetting, anti-amnesia, the process of recovering what was covered by the veil. And the text describes how this process happens, not all at once, not in a single moment of sudden enlightenment that resolves everything, in waves, like memory that returns in fragments, like dreams that seem more real than waking life, like encounters that reorient everything without you being able to explain how, like the sensation, which perhaps you have had more than once, that something was about to reveal itself completely, that you were on the verge of understanding something that would change everything, and then the mundane returned, and the revelation remained at the periphery of consciousness, present but not fully formulated. The Corpus Hermeticum says that these moments are not failures. They are anamnesis at work. They are the spark pushing against the veil and the veil giving way, not all at once but gradually, like melting ice. And what accelerates this process, according to the text, is exactly what you are doing now, recognizing the marks, not as religion, not as doctrine, as cartography, as looking at a map that described the territory you have always inhabited and finally having words for what you already knew was there. The threshold. Mark on the palm of your hand is the place where two worlds touch within you. The world that Yaldabaoth built with his Archons, dense, material, and full of veils, and the pleroma from which you came, luminous, without borders, and absolutely beyond any construction of power. The line on your palm is the seam between these two realities, and when you touch it with attention, with presence, without haste, you are performing the oldest gesture that exists. You are placing your hand on a threshold and asking for passage. But now I must show you what happens on the other side of that threshold. Because Gnostic texts do not just describe the marks, they describe what the marks announce. The Apocryphon of John ends with a promise that translators rarely highlight because it directly contradicts the entire theological structure that the official church built. John asks the being that appears to him, what happens to those who awaken? What happens to the pneumatic who recovers the memory of the pleroma? What happens to those who cross the threshold? And the being responds with an assertion that is, in every sense, the complete inversion of the system Yaldabaoth built. It says that the pneumatics who awaken do not return to the world of the Archons. That when the physical shell dissolves, they are not judged by the structures the demiurge created. That they do not pass through the seven spheres of the Archons being stripped of everything they accumulated. That they ascend directly, not to the heavens of Yaldabaoth, which are parts of the prison, but to the pleroma, back to the place where the spark came from, not as a reward for correct behavior, not as a prize for believing the right things, but by nature, because of what they are, because the spark, once awakened, is magnetically attracted to its origin, like water finding its level, like a flame joining a greater flame. Awakening is not acquisition, it is return. And this, more than any other Gnostic statement, is what needed to be suppressed. Because a system of power that controls access to salvation loses all control when salvation cannot be controlled. When it does not depend on a sacrament, does not depend on confession, does not depend on obedience to a structure, when it is simply what happens to who you are when you remember what you are. That is why the books were burned. That is why the texts were declared heresy. That is why the threshold mark was transformed into the lifeline by the traditions of palmistry that survived the purge, making it innocuous, turning a map of origin into a prediction of the future, shifting attention from what it is to what it supposedly foretells, so that you would never look at the palm of your hand and see what is actually there, the imprint of the place from which you came. There is one last thing I need to tell you about those who reach this point. About those who run their thumb across the palm of their hand and feel something they cannot name but recognize as truth. about those who read these texts and find not a strange doctrine, but the description of something they have always felt but had no words for. Gnosticism is not a religion of conversion. You do not enter it. You discover if you were in it all along. And the discovery does not happen from the outside in. It happens from the inside out. It begins with a sensation that has no origin, with a knowing that has no source, with a hunger that has no obvious object, with a line on the palm of the hand that, when touched with attention, seems to respond. The Nag Hammadi texts were kept by someone who knew that one day there would be those who needed them, not as archaeology, as a message, wrapped in leather, sealed in ceramic, buried in the desert with the patience of those who know that what needs to arrive will arrive when the time is right. 1700 years in the desert, and then a peasant digging for fertilizer, and then a mother who was afraid to throw it into the fire, and then decades of translation, of academic debate, of attempts to contain the impact of what had been found within the frameworks of what was already considered acceptable. And then you here now, with your thumb still tracing that line at the base of your palm. The text reached you across 1700 years of desert, of avoided fire, of survived purges, of translation and retranslation and endless debate. It reached you. This is no accident. And now, with the threshold mark under your thumb and the light of the pleroma on the other side of a veil that is thinner than it has ever been, the only question that remains is the one the Apocryphon of John places in the mouth of the being that appears to John in the disciples' darkest moment, the moment of mourning after the crucifixion, the moment when everything John thought he understood had been destroyed along with the Master. The question is not who you should become. The question is, who are you? You feel the line. You already know the answer.